The rain did not stop for 3 days after Thomas Gray's funeral. It wept against the windows of Gray Manor, collecting in rivulets that traced ghostly paths down the glass. The garden, once trimmed and tidy under Thomas's care, had turned to a sea of mud and bent flowers. Every rose seemed to bow in mourning. The villagers had come, of course, out of respect, out of curiosity, or perhaps both. They filled the parlor with murmurs and teacups, moving about as if tragedy was contagious. Their black coats glistened from the rain. Their hands reached out to pat Eleanor's arm, their words rehearsed and hollow. "Such a loss, Mrs. Gray. He was such a good man. You must rest, dear." But Eleanor did not rest. She could not. Her gaze had been fixed all through the service on the coffin that held her husband. Her fingers, pale and trembling, had clutched the edge of her black veil, as if holding on to it would keep her from falling apart entirely. And yet, through it all, she had remained composed, quiet, deliberate, graceful as ever. Only those who knew her well, which was hardly anyone, might have noticed how her eyes never once closed in grief. She was not crying. She was thinking. For in her heart there lived a quiet certainty that Thomas had not taken his own life. The coroner's report had been clear. A pistol found in his hand, a single gunshot wound to the temple, no sign of intrusion. The conclusion: suicide. But Eleanor could not reconcile that with the man she knew. Thomas Gray was meticulous, proud, devoted. He feared blood. He detested the sight of it. He was the kind of man who once fainted when their cook sliced her hand open while peeling apples, and yet they would have her believe he had lifted a gun to his own head. She could almost hear him laughing at the absurdity of it. When the last guest had gone and the carriages disappeared down the muddy lane, Eleanor stood at the window watching the last umbrella vanish into the mist. The house, so recently filled with hushed voices, now fell into a silence that pressed against her chest. She turned from the window and climbed the stairs to his study, the room no one had been allowed to touch since the night of his death. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of paper, ink, and pipe smoke. His chair remained slightly askew, as though he had only just risen. The ledger on his desk lay open, rain-spotted, as if it had been caught in the storm the night he died. The ink on the final line had bled and spread into unreadable pools. And then there was his journal. The small leather-bound book lay at the edge of the desk, a ribbon marking the final entry. She picked it up with both hands, her heart beating faster than it should. The truth must be confessed before she discovers. The sentence ended there. No name, no explanation. Just a broken line as if interrupted mid-thought. Eleanor's hands trembled. Her mind swirled with 100 questions. Before who discovers what? Who was he writing about? Who was the she? That night, unable to sleep, she lit a single candle in the study and began her own journal. The first line she wrote was simple, steady, and without hesitation. "I do not believe my husband took his own life. I will find the truth." It was both a promise and a warning. The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, its chime echoing through the empty corridors. She felt the stillness of the house deepen, the kind of stillness that feels like watching. And then a sound, a soft creak. Eleanor froze. The door to the study, which she was certain she had closed, was now slightly ajar. Beyond it only darkness. "Is someone there?" She called out, her voice calm, though her heart thudded hard in her chest. No answer, only the steady flicker of her candlelight and the rain tapping softly on the glass. She set her pen down and rose to close the door. But before her hand reached the knob, a faint breeze swept through the room, and the flame of her candle flickered out. The room plunged into darkness, and when she relit it moments later, her breath caught in her throat. The journal, Thomas's journal, no longer lay on the desk where she had left it. It now rested on the floor, open to a page she had not seen before. A page she was certain had not existed the last time she looked. There, scrawled hastily in familiar handwriting, was a single line. "Eleanor, forgive me." She stood staring at it for a long time, the candle trembling in her grasp. "Forgive you?" she whispered to the empty room. "For what?" But only the rain replied. The next morning brought no peace. Eleanor woke to the sound of the rain easing at last, the pale light of dawn seeping through the curtains. The house felt different somehow, lighter yet uneasy, as if holding its breath. She had not slept much, haunted by the words in Thomas's journal. "Forgive me." She had read them again and again, until the ink seemed to blur into her thoughts. What had he done that needed forgiveness? Was it something she already knew, or something she had yet to uncover? By breakfast, she found she had no appetite. The servants moved about quietly, their eyes lowered, still speaking in hushed tones whenever she entered a room. At the far end of the dining table sat the empty chair where Thomas used to read the morning paper, his coffee always placed precisely 2 inches from his right hand. She found herself staring at it for too long. She rose abruptly. "Have my carriage prepared," she said. "Ma'am?" asked the butler, startled. "I'm going into town." She had decided to speak to Inspector Hemsley, the man who had closed her husband's case with brisk efficiency and no patience for doubt. When she arrived at the small stone police station, the inspector greeted her with awkward courtesy. He was a man of middle age, all angles and suspicion, his fingers perpetually stained with ink. "Mrs. Gray," he said, rising from his desk. "I did not expect—" "You were wrong, Inspector," she interrupted softly. "My husband did not take his life." Hemsley sighed, already weary. "Mrs. Gray, I understand how grief clouds the mind. But the facts, she said, are convenient. A man of reputation dies in scandal, so you call it despair. But Thomas had no reason to end his life. None." He hesitated, then opened a drawer and drew out a folder. "Mrs. Gray, we found a note." She frowned. "A note?" He nodded and slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. "Found beside him. You were too distraught that night. I chose not to distress you further." She unfolded it carefully. "To my dearest Eleanor, forgive me. I can no longer bear the weight. You deserve peace, even if I cannot give it." It was signed with her husband's name. Her breath caught. The same words she had seen in his journal, except the handwriting was not the same. She knew her husband's writing intimately. The way his letter E curled inward, the neatness of his letter Y, the faint rightward slant of his lines. This note was clumsy, uneven, a mimic, but not his hand. "This is not his writing," she whispered. Hemsley frowned. "You're certain?" "Quite." He studied her face a moment longer, then closed the folder. "I will look into it," he said finally, though his tone suggested otherwise. But as she turned to leave, a clerk hurried into the room, carrying a small envelope. "Inspector," the young man said breathlessly, "message for you." Delivered by hand. Hemsley nodded distractedly and tore it open. His eyes flicked across the contents, and for the briefest moment something surprise, or perhaps alarm, passed over his face. Then he slipped the note into his coat pocket. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked. "No, Mrs. Gray," he said quickly. "Just routine." But as she stepped outside, she glanced back through the glass pane of the door and saw him unfold the note again, reading it with a furrowed brow. And she could have sworn she saw, at the bottom of the page, a familiar signature, T.G., that afternoon. As the carriage rolled back up the muddy lane to Gray Manor, she noticed someone standing at the gates. A man, tall and lean, his coat dark against the pale mist. His hat was pulled low, obscuring his face. "Stop," Eleanor ordered. The coachman hesitated but obeyed. She stepped out, the cold air biting at her cheeks. "Can I help you, sir?" The man lifted his gaze slowly. His eyes were sharp, almost unnervingly so, and yet familiar in a way she could not name. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Gray. You've found her." He inclined his head slightly. "My name is Samuel Blythe. I was once your husband's associate." Eleanor's heart skipped. "I wasn't aware Thomas had any recent business partners." He smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "There are many things, Mrs. Gray, that Thomas did not wish you to be aware of." She stiffened. "And what exactly brings you here now?" He glanced toward the house. "To warn you." Her breath caught. "Warn me? Of what?" He met her eyes then, and for a fleeting second she saw something dark there. Pity, perhaps, or fear. "Of the same thing," he said softly, "that killed your husband." Before she could speak again, he turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving her standing alone by the gate, her pulse thundering in her ears. That night, Eleanor could not shake the image of the man by the gate, Samuel Blythe. The way he had said those words, "the same thing that killed your husband." She tried to dismiss it as the cruel fancy of grief, or the opportunism of some stranger who had heard of her loss. But something in his tone had not felt like deceit. It had felt like warning. The rain had stopped at last, leaving the air heavy and still. The manor, vast and dimly lit, seemed to echo with every sound. The tick of the hallway clock, the sigh of floorboards, the faint cry of the wind beyond the windows. Unable to rest, Eleanor lit a candle and walked to her husband's study once more. The door creaked as she opened it, revealing the same scene as before: the untouched desk, the ledger, the empty chair. But this time her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. The corner of a rug, slightly lifted, as though someone had moved it and hastily placed it back. She bent down, moved it aside, and found what looked like a faint outline on the floorboards, a square with a small iron loop in the center, a hatch. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated for a moment, then hooked her fingers through the loop and pulled. The wooden panel lifted with a soft groan, revealing a small, dark compartment beneath. The air that rose from it was thick and stale, untouched for years. Inside she found a tin box. She lifted it out, brushed off the dust, and set it on the desk. It was locked, but the keyhole was old and worn. She tried one of the keys from Thomas's drawer, and it fit. The lid opened with a faint click. Inside were letters, a dozen or more, bound neatly with twine. Some bore the seal of a law firm in London. Others were personal, their ink faded but still legible. And then one caught her eye, An envelope addressed in her husband's handwriting, not to her, to Samuel Blythe. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Samuel, if anything happens to me, you must go to her. She deserves to know the truth, though it will destroy her, burn the others. No one must see them." Her heart pounded. The truth? Destroy her? She reached for the other letters, but before she could unfold the next one, the candle flickered, and then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the door. She froze, her hand hovering over the tin box. "Who's there?" She called out. No answer. She stood still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, right outside the study. Then silence. She took a careful step forward, her eyes on the door. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching across the floor like something alive. Finally, she pulled the door open and found no one there. The corridor was empty. Only the curtains stirred gently as a draft whispered through the house. But when she turned back toward the desk, the tin box was gone. It had vanished. Her breath caught. She looked around frantically, scanning the floor, the shelves, under the chair. Nothing. Only the faint scent of smoke. She followed it to the fireplace, and there, amidst the faintly glowing embers, she saw it, the remains of the tin box, crumpled and blackened, its letters curling into ash. Someone had been there, someone who did not want her to read them. By morning, Eleanor was no longer simply grieving. She was furious. The maid found her pacing before the window, her hair undone, her eyes sharp with purpose. "Shall I fetch you some tea, ma'am?" "No," Eleanor said. "Fetch the coachman instead. We're going to the village." "To the police, ma'am?" "No." Her tone was steady, her gaze fixed on the mist outside. "To Mr. Blythe." That same afternoon she found him at the edge of town, in a small cottage tucked behind the blacksmith's yard. He seemed unsurprised to see her. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "You burned them," she accused. "The letters." "You were in my house last night." His expression did not change. "If I hadn't, he might already be dead." "Why?" "What was in them?" He hesitated, then sighed. "It isn't what you think, Mrs. Gray. Your husband wasn't the man you believed him to be, and his death wasn't meant for him." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "I mean," he said slowly, "that you were the target." Eleanor stared at him, her breath shallow. "You're saying someone meant to kill me?" Samuel Blythe's gaze flickered toward the window, where the mist pressed against the glass like ghostly fingers. "I'm saying," he replied quietly, "that your husband died in your place." The words hit her like a blow. She sank slowly into the nearest chair, gripping the armrest as if to steady the world. "That's impossible." Thomas had no enemies. He was kind, generous. Blythe gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Generous men often make dangerous promises, and kind men," he looked at her sharply, "sometimes keep terrible secrets." She flinched, though she didn't know why. "What do you know of my husband?" He hesitated. "Enough to say he wasn't just a merchant." Her brow furrowed. "Then what was he?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rose and poured himself a measure of whiskey, the liquid catching the faint gray light. "Tell me, Mrs. Gray, before you married him, did he ever speak of his travels abroad?" Eleanor shook her head. "Only vaguely. He said business took him to the colonies, that it was trade work, spices, silks." Samuel's mouth curved into something between pity and regret. "Trade, yes, but not of the kind you imagine. He set down the glass, his expression hardening. Your husband was involved in smuggling, not for profit, but for influence. He moved documents, letters, secrets, and sometimes people for men who would rather the crown never knew of them. She stared at him in disbelief. That's absurd. I wish it were, he said simply. But when he tried to leave that world, they came for him. They gave him a choice, his silence or his family's safety. Eleanor's voice trembled. So they killed him. No, Blythe said. He chose death to protect you. The air between them fell heavy. For a long time neither spoke. Outside, a bell tolled somewhere in the village, deep and distant, marking the hour like the beat of a slow, relentless heart. At last Eleanor whispered, "Then why are you involved?" He turned to her then, eyes shadowed. "Because once I was part of the same circle. Thomas saved my life, twice. I owed him more than I could repay. And yet you burned his letters." "I burned them," he said sharply, "because they contained names, people still alive. People who would do anything to keep those secrets buried." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "If you value your life, Mrs. Gray, you'll forget you ever saw that box." But Eleanor Gray had never been one to obey fear. She rose to her feet, fire in her eyes. "You expect me to forget that someone tried to murder me? That my husband died in my place? No, Mr. Blythe. If he gave his life to protect me, then I'll see that sacrifice mean something." Blythe studied her for a long moment, admiration flickering where irritation should have been. "You remind me of him," he said finally, "stubborn to a fault." "Then help me," she said. "Tell me everything." He hesitated, then sighed. "You won't like what you hear. I've already lost everything that matters. The truth is all that's left." They spoke long into the evening. The candle between them burned low, and the shadows grew long. Bit by bit, Blythe told her of a network men of influence, merchants, and politicians who traded more than goods. They trafficked secrets, shaped votes, blackmailed nobles, even arranged deaths. Her husband had been their messenger, once trusted, silent, precise. But when he learned that their next target was her father, a magistrate investigating corruption in London, Thomas turned on them. He forged documents, misled contacts, and fled north with Eleanor, marrying her soon after. They found him years later, Blythe said quietly, and by then it was too late to run again. Eleanor's throat tightened. "And you, how do you fit into all this?" "I was the courier before him," Blythe admitted. "When I tried to leave, he helped me disappear. I repaid him by keeping watch from afar. Until now." "Yes, until now." He poured another drink, his voice lowering. "You're not safe here, Mrs. Gray. They'll come again once they learn the wrong person died." She stood, spine straight. "Then let them come." Something fierce flickered in Blythe's eyes. He hadn't expected courage. "You've your husband's spirit," he murmured. She met his gaze evenly. "No, I've my own." That night, as Eleanor returned to the manor, the fog had thickened. The gas lamps cast halos in the mist, the cobblestones gleaming wet beneath her boots. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark except for one, her husband's study.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for part 2.